We did it. Hello, everybody. Good noon to you. We're going to get started with the first in our series of federal focus webinars. Like many of you around the nation, or many folks around the nation, Maine Audubon is concerned with the actions taken by Congress and the federal government to weaken environmental
Nick, I can't hear. Are
Can you
you
hear me?
good? All right, sorry, I couldn't hear you for a second there.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Whew, nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
So we are concerned with actions taken by the federal government to
What is
weaken
going
the
on?
environmental rules that we rely on to protect Maine wildlife and wildlife habitat. One of those laws is the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. Passed in 1969, NEPA was one of the first major environmental laws passed in the United States, and over the years has proven to be perhaps the most consequential. But it has long been a target. And on February 25th of this year, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ, published an interim final rule to remove all of its regulations for implementing NEPA from the Code of Federal Regulations. What does that mean for NEPA? What does that mean for the environment? Well, today we are here to find out. Maine Audubon is honored to be joined today by Professor Anthony Moffa, Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Innovation at the University of Maine School of Law. Professor Moffa oversees the Environmental and Oceans Law Certificate Program at Maine Law. He teaches a variety of environmental law classes, as well as other classes like torts and trusts and estates. We'll turn it over to him in just a minute. I want to run through a little bit of tech before we get going. So first of all, this is the first in a series of 4 federal focus webinars. We have some news about our next one. A week from today, we'll be joined by a woman named Tessa Corsetti, who works as a bat coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She lost her job in the recent U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service cuts. And was going to come along a week from today and talk about her experience. However, I just learned over the weekend she was reinstated to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So she's back on the job. She starts the day of the webinar. So we may have to reorganize the timing of that or do other changes to get that information to you. So just stay tuned for that. We will be in touch. A week from then, on April 7th, we'll be hearing from Eric Schneider and Jesse Walls from the National Audubon Society, talking about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And then finally, on April 14th, we'll be hearing from Phil Coop from Revision Energy to talk about renewable energy and what you can do. So please stay tuned for that. I did want to say, I'll put it in the chat now, the actions that Professor Moffa will speak about in a minute have a federal comment deadline of March 27th. That is just 3 days from now. Maine Audubon is circulating a petition to our members and other folks in Maine to support NEPA, this very important law. So in the chat now, I have put a link to our petition. Please sign that. We'll be sharing that with the Council on Environmental Quality on the comment deadline. And I'll also be bringing these names to DC in early April when I head down there to talk to our delegation. So please sign that if you like, and I will probably be pumping that a couple more times. Easy tech stuff. So this is a webinar series, which means that we cannot see you or hear you. You are able to chat to the professor and I. For questions, which will be saved for the end, please put them in the Q&A box, which is down in the lower part of your screen there, and we will answer them in time. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Moffa. Welcome. Thank you for being here, and take it away.
Thanks for having me, Nick. I'm going to share my screen here. All right, that seems to be working.
Looks great.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming, and thanks for being interested in this subject and environmental law more broadly. We're going to talk a little bit about NEPA today and the federal government's current efforts to try to change the way we handle compliance with that statute and protection of the environment more generally. But I wanted to start with just a little bit about me. So I am a professor at Maine Law, as Nick said. I teach environmental law. I also teach natural resources. Prior to my time at Maine Law, I was in the General Counsel's office in the Environmental Protection Agency in headquarters in Washington, D.C. in the final term of President Obama. so President Obama's second term. I did a lot of work on things like NEPA and the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act and a bunch of other stuff, which we can get into in the questions if people have interest in that. I currently am, I sit on the board and on the executive committee of the board of the Friends of Casco Bay. So if any of you are a member of that organization, and through that organization, I collaborate with folks like Maine Audubon and all the other organizations in the Environmental Priorities Coalition, where I've been at Maine Law now for almost 10 years. A lot of my students, former students, I should say, are in these organizations. So a lot of coordination with them as well. So you may have seen me in one of those places. And if you do after this, and you haven't seen me before, feel free to come up and say hi. So let's talk about NEPA. And that story, our story starts in the 1960s. And that story in the 1960s really can be traced to the decades prior in the United States, where we had basically uncontrolled discharge of pollutants into our air and water. Pretty famously, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire, and I have some archival footage here that I like to show about what the pollution in the Cuyahoga looked like. I won't show this whole video, just the first minute or so, but it's quite appalling, I think, under today's standards.
The Cuyahoga River, as most think of it, the brown stream that meets Lake Erie, an industrial waterway, its banks populated by steel mills and factories, its channel filled with ships and tugs. The Cuyahoga River, as it reaches Lake Erie after a 100-mile twisting and turning journey from its headwaters, is an exhausted stream, abused and misused by man and his machines. Today, nearly 2 million people live and work in the river basin.
Okay, I'll stop it there. Just you get the idea. This video goes on to show how the Cuyahoga River was effectively used as a dump and a sewer. Pretty much all of our rivers were, and that includes here. Here's a picture of the fire that resulted from jumping oil and other flammable chemicals just directly into the waterway. And it wasn't just there, right? Pretty famously here in Maine, the Androscoggin River prompted this letter that you see a little piece of here from Suzanne to Senator Ed Muskie, asking him to do something about the river pollution. And why was that we felt that urge to do something federally? Probably most of you know this story, is that federal environmental law really didn't exist in the sense that we understand it today until the end of the 1960s and these sort of catalyzing events in the Cuyahoga River and the Androscoggin and elsewhere, where people demanded that Congress do something. I think one of the more interesting components of this story is the politics of that initiative, that movement. And so here's a statement from the time. Our national government today is not structured to make a coordinated attack on the pollutants which debase the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the land that grows our food. Indeed, the present governmental structure for dealing with environmental pollution often defies effective and concerted action. You may be surprised to learn that those words were spoken by none other than Richard Nixon. It was at the end of this decade, in the 1960s, and the beginning of what we call the environmental decade of the 1970s, that the first federal environmental statutes were passed. And of those federal environmental statutes, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, was the first major statute, which is the subject of our conversation today. So it was this movement that I just kind of very quickly laid out that led to NEPA's initial passage at the end of the 1960s into the 1970s. NEPA was introduced by this senator from the state of Washington. You see him here fishing, and then signed by President Richard Nixon, right? Pretty famously, right towards the end of his term. What is NEPA? So every time I teach this statute in my classes, I like to start with Section 101 because I think it's one of the most profound statements of environmental policy that Congress has ever passed. It says Congress recognizing the profound impact of man's activity on the interrelations of all components of the natural environment, and then recognizing population growth, high density urbanization, industrial expansion, resource exploitation, calling all of those things out, saying that those things are important, and recognizing, however, that there's a critical importance of restoring and maintaining the environmental quality to the overall welfare and development of man. And this is where it gets, I think, really at the heart of what NEPA is about. The statute declares that the continuing policy of the federal government to use all practicable means and measures, including financial and technical assistance, in a manner calculated to foster and promote the general welfare, that to create and maintain conditions under which man and nature can exist in productive harmony and fulfill the social, economic, and other requirements of present and future generations of Americans. I won't spend too much time dwelling on this, but just out of whenever I look at it, I'm reminded of some of the reasons why I find environmental policy so compelling and interesting and important. We see here that the coexistence of man and nature, using the language harmony, right, fulfill social, economic, and other requirements, and then the intergenerational equity that the statute calls, Congress calls on federal agencies to respect, is, I think, a pretty significant statement enacted in federal law that remains effective and binding federal law today. And so I wanted to just stop there for a second and appreciate that language. So what does it really do? So I again, I like to think about NEPA as a statute that's full of what I would colloquially call alphabet soup, right? And so I've already said one of the acronyms you see up here, NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, but then it's full of all these other acronyms as well: EIS, EA, CEQ, FONSI. We'll talk briefly about, I'll just quickly define them so that as we go through what the statute does, you'll understand what exactly I'm talking about. So CEQ is the Council on Environmental Quality. It is not an agency in the way that EPA is an agency. It is a part of the executive office of the president, and it is tasked with interpreting NEPA and doing other things under the statute, which we'll talk about in a few moments. But this is the group of people who the statute tasks with administering it itself, right? The other acronyms you see on here: EIS, Environmental Impact Statement. This is the primary requirement of the statute, that federal agencies conduct and produce, conduct environmental analysis and produce an environmental impact statement when their activities will have an impact on the environment. We'll talk about that in a moment as well. An EA is what's called an environmental assessment. This is an assessment that federal agencies are to use to determine whether there's a significant impact requiring the preparation of an EIS. And then my favorite acronym, perhaps in all of environmental law, the FONSI, right, is a finding of no significant impact. So a FONSI results from an EA. And you'll see in a flowchart in a moment just exactly what that means. But I just want to get these terms out there as we delve deeper into this. So Section 106 of the Act is the primary driver of the Act's requirements. It says an agency shall issue an environmental impact statement with respect to an action requiring an environmental document that has a reasonably foreseeable significant effect on the quality of the human environment. And I want to just focus in on a couple of those words: agency action and significant effect. So agency action is anything that any federal agency does requires an EIS if it would have a foreseeable significant impact on the human environment. And that includes everything from agencies that build infrastructure, that contract for infrastructure to be built, like the Army Corps of Engineers, for instance, to agencies that just give permission for private actors to build things, like the Department of Energy, for instance. Even that that authorization is an agency action that could trigger NEPA compliance. And what does NEPA compliance means? It means the preparation of an environmental impact statement. And just to emphasize this, this statute, the Supreme Court has interpreted it in this way, that it is procedural rather than substantive. And what that means is the statute requires federal agencies to analyze the environmental impacts of their actions. It does not require them to choose the least harmful of the options they evaluate. It makes no statement, or at least NEPA imposes no requirement, or it makes no binding determination that an agency has to choose the least impactful of the options that it considers. It just requires that the agencies do that analysis, and do that analysis in a transparent way that allows for people like you and I to comment on that analysis, and hopefully leads to the agency considering those environmental impacts when it's making its ultimate decision. That's the bottom line. That's what NEPA does. So going a little bit further into how it works, this is, I think, a really helpful and sort of simplified flow chart of what agencies in the federal government are supposed to be doing in order to comply with NEPA. The first question that an agency should be asking is the action of that agency going to have effects that are significant upon the environment? If the answer is yes, then the agency is done in terms of this flow chart. They have to just go straight to preparing an environmental impact statement. If the answer is no, or is uncertain, then the agency prepares an environmental assessment, which is what I mentioned earlier. This assessment is meant to determine whether or not that agency action will be significant. So if it's obvious that it's going to be significant, you just go straight to EIS. You'll sometimes hear NEPA attorneys and NEPA policy folks describe an action as a straight to EIS action, because they know that that type of action will have a significant impact on the environment. Think, allowing drilling on federal land, at least in the past, that's been something that would go straight to EIS. Right? We can assume that there's going to be a significant environmental impact. Compare that with two other decisions that agencies make every day, and it might not be so obvious that there's going to be a significant environmental impact, which is the point of the environmental assessment, determine whether there's going to be a significant environmental impact. Whether you're preparing an EIS or an EA, a big piece of the analysis is what we call an alternatives analysis, or the development of alternatives. So the agency deciding, looking at an option, at a project and an action, and saying, what are our options here, and what are these effects of those various options, right? In the EA world, once those options have been identified, we then have to determine whether there's going to be a significant impact in any of those situations. If yes, then we have to prepare a full EIS. If the answer is no, then the agency, issues a FONSI, finding of no significant impact, and makes a decision. This is the general way that NEPA functions. I don't have enough time to get into the nitty-gritty of each of these pieces of the process, because I want to make sure we have time to talk about what's going on now. But just to give you an example of what I think are some of the features and the bugs of NEPA in practice, some of you may remember the Dakota Access Pipeline controversy that's actually still ongoing today in some ways. If you remember that effort was about the preparation or lack of preparation of an environmental impact statement by the Army Corps of Engineers for permitting the Dakota Access Pipeline. And in particular, this makes concrete some of the concepts I was talking about earlier. You can see on the map in the slide an alternative that was considered but ended up being rejected. So in the EIS, they would have analyzed the environmental impacts of each of those alternatives, right? That's what NEPA would require. Indeed, the advocates that were pushing to not have this pipeline go through, or at least go very close to, if not through, indigenous land here, they actually won in court. And a court ordered the preparation of a full EIS that addressed their concerns. That is NEPA working well, right? It's forcing the agency to consider environmental impacts. However, on the flip side, because the court recognized that it's only a procedural requirement and so much had already been done on the pipeline, putting it in the path that you see here, the preferred alternative, the court did not issue an injunction to stop the pipeline's construction while the EIS was being prepared. So in other words, while they messed up procedurally and still needed to do a full environmental impact statement, the Army Corps of Engineers and the company Energy Partners could still build the pipeline while they were preparing the EIS. And indeed, that's exactly what happened, right? And the pipeline is now flowing, even though the EIS is still being litigated. So this is just an example of how you can argue about whether NEPA's utility, right? Are we eventually going to get a fulsome treatment of all the environmental impacts of the Dakota Access Pipeline by the federal government? Absolutely. Is that full report going to stop the pipeline from ruining potentially this indigenous land? No, it's already doing that. And so that's sort of the push and pull here of people who want to argue whether NEPA needs to be reformed. The other piece of the NEPA reform conversation is this argument you hear about compliance with NEPA taking a long time, costing a lot of money. Environmental impact statements are often prepared by outside contractors who are paid significant money by the federal agency to complete them. That this graph is not about the cost of preparing the EIS, which you can also find that data online. This is just about the average time it takes to complete an environmental impact statement for a federal project. And you can see the average time is just over 4 years, 4.5 years in the 8-year period of this study. And you can, if you look to the far right of the graph, at that tail end, you see some really scary numbers, right? Those are EISs that took 14, 15, 16, 17 years to complete for federal projects. This is another source of criticism that you often hear launched at NEPA and compliance with NEPA. It takes a long time and it slows down projects that are needed. Again, this is something that I think environmental advocates, especially in the climate space, are really taking a hard look at, given that we need to build renewable energy infrastructure at a pace that might not be consistent with the time that it takes to prepare a full EIS under the current structure. And so even during the Biden administration, there were efforts to reform the way that we approach the NEPA compliance, right? That through CEQ. Right? This is to say that there's been a renewed attention on CEQ and what we'll talk about in a second, the NEPA regulations that has existed since towards the end of my time in government, and then certainly during the first Trump administration, and then certainly during the Biden administration, and now again during the Trump administration. This is something that's getting a lot of attention. So here's just a quick timeline of where we are in terms of the regulations, which is the thing that Nick mentioned at the beginning that's just happening now. So as I said, in 1970, right at the turn of the decade, President Nixon signs NEPA into law. It takes 8 years before CEQ issues regulations telling other federal agencies how they could comply with NEPA, how to prepare an EIS, how to prepare an EA, what's in them. That's what the CEQ regulations do. They were an executive order from President Carter at the time told CEQ to issue such regulations. They did. Those 1978 regulations have existed for roughly 4 decades without ever being revised, and all the federal agencies that followed them and used them. And there were guidance documents prepared in the 1980s, a particularly important one called the CEQ 40 questions document, which is essentially answers questions that agencies might have when they're preparing environmental impact statements and EISs. That if you see this timeline until 2020, there really wasn't any significant revision to those regulations. 2020, we see the first attempt to revise these regulations at the end of President Trump's first term. Right, those revisions were tested in court in late 2020, early 2021, but those cases all ended up being mooted out because on January 20th, 2021, President Biden issued a new executive order, and that was shortly followed by some regulations, sort of revising NEPA regulations back to the way it was before with some slight tweaks. That brings us to this new administration. January 20th, 2025, we have an executive order from President Trump unleashing American energy. In that executive order are a lot of things. I won't talk about all of them, but the part that's relevant here is a clear directive to streamline the permitting process, especially as it relates to the construction and deployment of conventional energy and extraction of natural resources, and the permitting that's required for those activities. And the response from CEQ to that executive order and a few others is to issue an interim final rule on February 25th, 2025, which repeals all of the CEQ NEPA regulations dating back to 1978. In other words, the interim final rule, which will go into effect in just a few weeks in April, after that rule goes into effect, the NEPA regulations will no longer be effective. They are repealing those regulations. And just to be clear, what will that look like? Is that NEPA allows for federal agencies to develop their own processes for compliance with NEPA and issue their own regulations saying this is how we are going to comply with it. So just to pick a random federal agency out of a hat, Department of Transportation. Department of Transportation has their own NEPA process and their own NEPA regulations. They don't have to follow the CEQ regulations because they've done it themselves. The CEQ regulations existed as a backstop for federal agencies that did not have their own regulations or had only slight tweaks to the CEQ process and relied on the CEQ processes otherwise. What is interesting about this interim final rule that the Trump administration just put out is that at the same time, they are directing federal agencies that do not have their own NEPA regulations to just continue to follow the CEQ rule even after they repeal it. They say just treat it as guidance and keep following it until you develop your own regulation. Along with that, they're also directing, in these executive orders like Unleashing American Energy and a few others, the president is directing these agencies when they are crafting new NEPA regulations for their own actions. So now there won't be any backstop CEQ regulations. Every agency will have their own NEPA compliance regulations. All of those regulations will, at least pursuant to what the president would prefer, that those regulations follow the directives in this Unleashing American Energy executive order, so that they are streamlining the permitting process for certain types of energy projects. They are making it less onerous, back to this idea, for compliance with NEPA for preparation of an EIS. Going back a little bit, right, to this process, right here, developing alternatives. A big piece of the NEPA litigation that has existed. So NEPA litigation generally takes the form of an environmental group alleging that the federal government has not prepared an adequate environmental impact statement or has failed to prepare any environmental impact statement when one is necessary. When that environmental group is challenging the adequacy of an environmental impact statement, one of the key places that they have challenged those environmental impact statements is the alternatives analysis. In that, groups will often allege that the federal government has left off clear alternatives to their plan. One thing that is certainly required, as case law makes clear, is that every environmental impact statement include what's called a no action alternative. That is an alternative where the agency just decides we're not going to do this. But between no action and the preferred action, there are lots of other intermediate options, and it is difficult in practice. I can say from having counseled on this, it's difficult to decide how many of those alternatives and which ones you need to consider as the federal government. You think about something like a highway project or a high-speed rail line, right? Conceivably, there are almost infinite options as to the length of that highway or that rail project, right? It could go 1 mile longer or 1 mile shorter. Does the agency need to analyze literally every single iteration of that particular project? The answer is obviously no. So where is that line, right? Obviously, or maybe perhaps not so obviously, but in using my rail or highway example, a longer extended version of the highway or a shorter version or an intermediate version, you probably need to have something that fits into each of those categories, right? And a lot of what ends up defining what those alternatives are is this scoping process. So, and the purpose and need for the action. So that's the agency saying, we need this, right? We need more transportation options for accessing, national parks, let's say. I'm making this up, right? That would be the purpose and need for the action, right? If that's the purpose and need, there are certain things that would actually achieve that purpose, and then there are other alternatives that don't achieve that purpose at all. And obviously, you don't have to consider the ones that don't speak to the purpose. And so those two things interact with one another. This is all just a long-winded way of saying a lot of the push and pull in whether an EIS is good enough has to do with how the agency describes what it's doing and what they need to do and what the alternatives are for doing that. What we will likely see in these, given what they've signaled with this latest rulemaking, is that we will have a much more constrained view of what those alternatives are. The purpose and need will be much more specific and directive, and speaking to like almost exactly to a preferred solution is what I would imagine we will get to. And the regulations will say that's how, just analyze that. The other piece of it, the other piece that is litigated often and will likely be addressed by the new round of regulations coming out of each agency after these CEQ regs are taken down, is what type of effects count. So a big piece, and should be considered, a big piece of the changes during the Biden administration, look at tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, and protecting public health and the environment, and restoring science to tackle the climate crisis. You can tell right from the names of those EOs directing changes to the CEQ regs that those regulations and those executive orders were pointed at requiring federal agencies to consider climate change impacts of their actions within their environmental impact statements. We are going in the other direction now. It is very unlikely that agencies will be issuing new regulations saying that they're going to consider climate change impacts. And to zoom out a little bit, where that conversation has started, even before we were talking about climate, is about how direct the environmental impacts need to be in order for them to be considered and be part of an environmental impact statement. So back to my highway example. In constructing a highway, obviously there's going to be impacts on land where you're constructing that highway, but cars drive on that highway. So should the agency be considering the emissions from those cars as part of the environmental impact of permitting the highway construction, that is the type of question that likely would have been answered yes during the Biden administration, and likely is going to be answered no during the pursuant to the changes that I foresee coming. That is an example in the climate context of what you might call indirect versus direct environmental impacts. And the other question in terms of environmental impacts is this question of whether we can count cumulative impacts, like impacts over time. And that is often a conversation we have in the extraction of the permitting of extracting natural resources from federal land, right? So you think about permitting one oil well on Bureau of Land Management land out west. Well, how many oil wells are already there? Is that something we need to consider? Or do we just need to consider what the impact of that one new well is going to be? And that is often another debate and another place where I see the administration likely pointing us towards, no, let's not consider cumulative impacts. Let's just consider isolated impacts of the one new project that's before us right now. And so those are just some examples of how I see the direction shifting. And again, those are the areas where we've had conflict in the past around whether an environmental impact statement is adequate or what needs to be in it. And that's why I anticipate there being the moves there. And there's some signaling towards those being the moves in the Trump executive order. But as I said, all they did with the interim final rule, rather interestingly, is just eliminate all the old rules. And they're not at this time proposing to replace them with new CEQ rules. They're just telling every agency to make your own rules about NEPA, which is a sort of interesting and a bit odd way of doing this if they want everybody to get in line quickly. And so I might not be surprised if we do see CEQ doing something in a couple months to a year, if we don't see agencies sort of all falling in line and issuing new NEPA process regs that are more in keeping with the executive orders that we've seen out of this new administration. But I'll stop there because I imagine there are questions, and I went relatively quickly here in order to get to them.
Heck yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Moffa. That was outstanding. I am a graduate myself of University of Maine School of Law. I really miss learning about laws. I think we have such a fascinating system in the US, and there's so much intricacy and detail that it's sort of a lot. And so I think for some folks out there, and please, let me say too, if you have questions, please put them down below in the Q&A box. That's most helpful. Please don't type them in the chat on the right side because they're easy to lose over there. But for sort of stepping back just a little bit, can you explain for folks who haven't been to law school in a while, just remind folks the difference between, so for example, does the president have the right to eliminate NEPA? And sort of what's the difference between, a statute and the regulations, and what the president can do versus what Congress can do?
Yeah, so great. Thank you for that. No, the president doesn't have the ability to eliminate NEPA. NEPA is an act of Congress. It's a law signed, as I said, and as you just saw me scrolling through, by President Nixon. And I came back to this slide because this is as I said, the main requirement of NEPA, the preparation of an environmental impact statement for agency activities that will have a significant impact on the environment. And that's going to be part of our law unless and until Congress repeals that statute. The question that is now put before us by the Trump executive order and the recent proposed rules, or the recent interim final rule, I should say, to take out the CEQ regs, is what it means to comply with this section. And that's why I highlighted sort of some of these words here, like what is the significant effect on the environment, right? Maybe we see a shifting idea of what that is, right? What type of agency actions are we evaluating? What level are we evaluating them at? We might see a shift on that. And some of the other things I talked about as well. But those are about how agencies comply with this law. And they assume, all those answers assume that this law will remain in place, that Congress won't repeal it, right? We're not discussing repealing NEPA. We're just talking about how you meet the requirement of the statute.
Excellent. Thank you. So can we talk a little bit about what this may mean for Maine? So let's say this goes through, CEQ strips its own regulations. There is some project proposed for Maine, and I don't know, could be the oversight could be from an agency with its own regs or without.
Yeah.
How might things change if this goes through?
Yeah. So first of all, there's not a, if this goes through is not really a question. It's an interim final rule. It's going to go into effect. I guess there is a question: will a court strike it down as inappropriate, and it's going to be challenged in court? And for that reason, I think you said at the beginning, there's a comment period that's open right now. I encourage your members and anyone interested to comment, because those comments will be highly relevant in that litigation, examining the, like, whether or not this rule that just is in effect is a rule that just blanks out a whole bunch of other rules, whether that rule makes sense, to put it in sort of layman's terms. And if you have a whole bunch of people commenting this rule doesn't make any sense, that's helpful to the people who are trying to get the rule overturned. So just as a beginning point, that's worth noting. Now, you asked what could this mean for Maine? Well, it kind of depends on the project, as you suggest, and paradoxically, it could mean faster. Overall, it's likely going to mean speedier approvals of any projects that require federal approval, right? And what does that mean in Maine? You know, the ones where I would be worried, like deforestation, potentially in the national forest, to the extent that that touches Maine on the border of New Hampshire. You have some like fisheries implications potentially. There's been a lot of talk about offshore wind here in the state of Maine. It'll be interesting to see how this works with that, because the two policies of this government here seem to be pushing against each other, right? So you have this policy suggesting, well, we should fast track approvals of everything, but then you have the rest of the Unleashing American Energy EO that says, like, well, we should be fast tracking oil and gas and coal, but not wind and solar. So I don't know how that ends up working out here at the end of the day. So that's a very difficult question. I think we are fortunate here in Maine to not, I mean, the lithium deposits potentially could be impacted by this in terms of to the extent they need federal approvals. We aren't sitting on a bunch of shale gas or oil like some other states. And we don't have a ton of federal land where that activity might be happening. In those states, you know, I would be very worried about those projects being accelerated as a result of this EO and the accompanying CEQ action to repeal these regs.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, another one that jumps to mind might be transmission lines in Maine. You know, there are several proposed transmission lines for various parts of Maine.
Sure.
Maine Audubon recognizes we really need more electrical transmission capacity, but we want to make sure that it's done right and done with consideration. You know, and that's really what NEPA is about. It's such an unusual and sort of interesting statute, because it just requires you to think. At its essence, it just says, let's just take a look at what we're doing before we do it. It's not super prescriptive, as you said. It doesn't require the best alternative, but it requires you to take a look at what you're doing, which has been so helpful for thousands of projects around the country, because that could uncover other environmental impacts that you didn't anticipate, which some may be more triggering for ESA or for Clean Water Act, you name it. But it also just requires you to just take a look at things. And it also gives people the opportunity to participate, which leads me into this question too. So in the next future scenario, either as CEQ develops new regs or agencies develop their own, how might public participation be affected? Public participation is, of course, a cornerstone of the NEPA process, where there's a number of public comment opportunities throughout the process. How may those be impacted going forward?
Yeah, so you know, as I think this interim final rule is sort of a good example, right? So I keep using that language because it is what we call in administrative law an interim final rule, which is an unusual type of rulemaking. Usually, when agencies make regulations, it goes through a process that we call notice and comment rulemaking, where the agency says, hey, everybody in the public, we are thinking about doing a rule, a regulation about this subject. We'd like your input. And here's what we're thinking of doing. And that's what we call a proposed rule. And then people have an opportunity to comment on that proposal. And then the agency absorbs those comments, responds to them, and maybe tweaks what they were going to do or changes it completely, and then issues a final rule. Here, the agency CEQ, I should say, is doing it what's called an interim final rule, which skips that notice part of the process. It allows for comment, but it says we're going to make this rule is going to go into effect immediately, and you can comment on it, on what you think how it's going to work, but it's going into effect. And so there is no proposal, and it's only allowed in certain rare circumstances, and the agency and CEQ is maintaining that those circumstances are satisfied here. That's going to be a big part of the litigation about whether this rulemaking is legitimate, before we even get to the substance of gutting all of the CEQ regs. So, and the reason I bring that up is because I think it's indicative of the approach that they want to take here, which would suggest cutting out the notice and comment process whenever they can, including on these EISs as much as they can, whittle that down to nothing. And so I'm concerned about that for sure. I think that's a real potential.
Thank you. I want to put in the chat. So Janet mentioned we have there are lots of people around the country commenting on that. Maine Audubon is working on our own organizational comments. We have this petition going to our members that will support them. But Janet asked too, is it also beneficial to comment directly to the agency, to the CEQ? And the answer is yes. As Professor Moffa said, it's great to get those comments on record as well, and to share things that'll be part of the public record. And so the link I just put in the chat is a link to the regulations.gov comment area for this project. And so say whatever you'd like on that, but that's an opportunity to comment directly to the CEQ about this rulemaking. And again, the deadline for that is the 27th, just a couple of days from now. So thank you there. John G had an interesting sort of technical question about the costs associated with this. He says, under NEPA, when projects were proposed by private entities, such as a pipeline company, are they required to reimburse the government for the cost of completing an EIS?
The answer is yes, for the most part. And it's not even reimbursed. It's a lot of times contract and pay directly the third-party environmental engineers and assessors who are doing the work. If you're applying for a permit that requires an EIS to complete the project, you're likely going to be held responsible for making that EIS happen. There's a little bit of wiggle room here, especially when you talk about in the Dakota Access Pipeline case. Is a good example of this. Like the court says, go back and make it better, right? Then we might get into some of what John's question is getting at, like who's going to pay for making it better at that point, right? The agency who said it was good when you gave it to them, or you who did it, you entity, private company that did it in the first place. So, but generally speaking, yes, if you're seeking a federal permit for something and it's going to require an EIS, you're paying for that, right? So we as taxpayers don't have to worry about that, the cost piece of it so much.
Excellent. Looking at new questions here. Actually, there was a quick question about the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Greenpeace situation. A little off topic, but is it a can of worms we don't want to open?
I mean, it's a can of worms. It's also terrible. I mean, it's terrible.
Yeah. Can you summarize maybe? I don't want to put you on the spot. But...
Yeah. The very quick version of this is that the Energy Transfer Partners, the Dakota Access Pipeline Company, sued Greenpeace for obstructing the pipeline's construction and doing trespassing, doing a whole bunch of other things, basically trying to hold Greenpeace responsible for all of the protest actions that occurred. It in some ways resonates with like what's going on at Columbia right now, with trying to hold like individuals responsible for the actions of whole groups of diffuse protesters. And a New York court let them do that in the Greenpeace action. A jury came down in favor, or sorry, not New York, it was North Dakota. But a jury came out in favor of Energy Transfer Partners and held Greenpeace liable for, I think it's almost 300 million or so in damages, which, they're obviously going to appeal, but is not a good result if you're Greenpeace or any other environmental advocacy organization. Obviously, or perhaps it's not obvious, but it is to me, Greenpeace did not organize all of those people showing up at Dakota Access. In fact, it's kind of a bit insulting to the tribes to suggest that Greenpeace is the one who facilitated all of that protest, and that they weren't, already concerned about their own land being trampled on by this pipeline. But yeah, we'll see what happens there. That's a bad situation.
Thank you. So I want to give a couple of questions here. I just want to clarify the situation, because this is not intuitive for a lot of folks who maybe haven't gone, through school. So we have NEPA and we have the CEQ regulations. What exactly happens when those regulations go away?
When they go away, agencies will be required to comply with the statute, right? So if their action has a perceivable significant effect on the environment, they will have to prepare an EIS. What changes is how they prepare that EIS and what process they follow and what is in that EIS. Because if prior to the rules being repealed, this was an agency, in this hypothetical case we're talking about, that just did what CEQ told them to do in terms of what types of contractors to hire, how to prepare the EIS, etc. They now have more wiggle room to interpret this statute's requirements as that agency sees fit, right? And they're not bound by what CEQ tells them they have to do. Now, without getting hyper technical, there's always been some debate as to how binding the CEQ regulations were on other agencies, because the statute itself doesn't ever say the Council on Environmental Quality is empowered to make regulations that bind other federal agencies. The statute does not include that language. It creates the Council on Environmental Quality. It gives them a purpose to provide guidance and help with NEPA compliance, but it doesn't ever say directly you can bind other federal agencies. And so that's always been a hotly debated topic. That won't even be, that debate is gone, because there's nothing from CEQ even purporting to bind other agencies. And so the agencies are free to do whatever they think is compliance with the statute. It's going to create it has the potential to create a mess of litigation. Because whereas before we had courts could look to the CEQ regulations and say, even if these aren't binding, this is a good model of what NEPA compliance looks like, and it has been for 40 years. Did you, agency whose EIS is being challenged, did you follow generally what the CEQ says you should be doing or not? Well, now, without those CEQ rules, the court is going to say, well, did what you do, agency, comply with the statute? Now we got to go back to the statutory text and have courts trying to interpret what that statute means, when it says a bunch of things, but it's not hyper specific about pages and the number of contractors and the type of that's all the kind of things that was in this, all the type of stuff that was in the CEQ regulations, is no longer there for courts to look at, and now courts are going to have to make that decision, especially if agencies start doing it differently. I suspect we won't see major changes to some of it. I suspect the changes we see in agency practice will be along the lines I suggested, that we'll try to move things quicker, try to make these things shorter, try to take shortcuts, and those shortcuts may be permitted by courts without the existence of the CEQ regulations. What I don't expect to see is all these agencies reinventing what NEPA compliance means, because they've been doing it a certain way and following certain steps for so long. It's just, what are they going to do within those steps? I think they're going to truncate a lot of it. That's what I expect.
Excellent. And so there are a couple of questions about what may happen now from various groups who want to challenge outcomes or decisions. And so you can either take over or correct me if I'm wrong, that, you know, an organization would basically wait until an agency makes a decision using NEPA, either decides to issue an EA or an EIS, or it's faulty, and then it's challenged on you know, just as any other challenge would be, on the merits. But now the courts, depending on where it is, may have different tools to look to and to decide the case, right?
Yeah, I would say they have less tools now, because with the CEQ regulations were a very important tool in deciding whether or not an EIS was appropriately prepared. That tool, after this, if assuming this new regulation goes into effect and the CEQ rules are gutted, there won't be that tool for courts to look at anymore. Yeah. And so I think it opens up a lot of possibilities in the directions it could go. And as we've seen in other areas of environmental and really other types of important federal law, you may see some really significant regional differences here. You know, some circuit courts may feel like may basically track the CEQ, the old CEQ regulations, even if they're not there anymore. And you might have courts in more in different districts, in different parts of the different circuits, different parts of the country, be more aggressive in saying, you know, well, the statute says this, you've done that, you're done. And so it's hard to say sitting here, you know, forecasting ahead to a year or two down the line. I do think one thing that's important, as we're running out of time here, to highlight in this situation, as in so many others right now, that it's not just about the change in direction, it's also in how it's happening, in that this is gutting the CEQ. So let's assume a president is elected in 4 years who wants to change the direction back and reinstate some uniformity through CEQ regulations. Well, there likely won't be a CEQ, or at least a CEQ staffed to do that because of what this administration is doing. And so it could take a lot longer to rebuild this than it is taking to dismantle it. And that's not just in this situation. It's all across the federal government right now. And so I know you probably hear this every day, so I don't mean to be doom and gloom, but I do think that is it's a real reason to challenge this, to hope that these CEQ regulations stay in place so that infrastructure remains there if the tides turn in the near future.
Outstanding. Well, it is 1:02, which means that we should end here. I will say that Maine Audubon will continue to fight this for years to come, and our environmental partners, so stay tuned. I want to thank Professor Moffa so much for joining us today. That was outstanding. The NEPA is a law worth knowing about and worth protecting. Thank you, Professor, for joining us today. Thank you all for joining. I will be sending some links and recordings around later on. Please join us for the remainder of the webinars in coming weeks, and have a great week. Thank you all.